The story begins not with a trial, not with a headline, but with a shovel hitting something wet in the earth. Denton, Maryland, 1829. A farmer digging for a well strikes bone, not one skeleton, but many. A mass of twisted limbs, shackled wrists, jaws locked open as if screaming in silence. Children's skulls, women's spines bent at angles of torment. Word spreads, but slowly, because the people who find these bones know exactly whose land they were buried on. The land belonged to Patty Cannon. For decades her name has been whispered in taverns and churches, not in sermons, but as a curse. She wasn't just a murderer, she was a hunter. Her prey were free African Americans, families torn from the soil of their lives, abducted, chained, and disappeared. But what history never fully told was the other truth. The ritualistic element, the strange symbols carved into door frames, the sermons about blood and obedience in the local chapel, and the silence that stretched across towns that dared not interfere. In America's forgotten archives, her story remains an infection hidden beneath the skin of the nation. Patty Cannon was not a woman shaped by gentleness. Born sometime in the late 1700s, she lived on the Maryland, Delaware border, a region where freedom and slavery coexisted uneasily. Free black families carved out fragile lives, walking each day under the shadow of being recaptured or falsely enslaved. Patty exploited that fear. With her gang, a network of kidnappers and corrupt lawmen, she targeted free African Americans, children walking home from church, farmers in their fields, women in the dim light of morning. They vanished into wagons. They were chained in her attic. Some were sold south into the endless nightmare of slavery. Others never made it that far. Neighbors whispered of screams at night, of figures moving lanterns through her property at impossible hours. Yet no one intervened. Part fear, part complicity. The sheriff drank at her table. Local businessmen bought her silence with coin and favors. And the church, the very place where souls were to be protected, remained locked in its own cowardice. Patty Cannon was not just a criminal. She was a symptom of something larger, a society willing to look away. Her farmhouse became infamous. The windows were always shuttered, the barn doors barred with rusted iron. Children dared each other to creep near its hedgerows, where dogs barked with a feral violence. And yet, the most terrifying stories weren't about the outside of the house, but the inside. Survivors later described the attic. The chains bolted into the beams, the scorched marks on the wooden floor where fires had been lit. The carvings, crosses, circles, sigils that seemed older than Christianity itself. Some swore Patty had marked her captives with hot iron not just for control, but for something stranger, something ritualistic. When investigators finally entered years later, they found stains in the walls that no fire could erase. They found a ledger in Patty's handwriting, cataloging names and dates like a merchant of souls. And in the cellar, they found dozens of small shoes, children's shoes. Some believed she killed to erase evidence. Others believed she killed for something else: power, the silence of neighbors, the refusal of officials to prosecute, the strange alignment of deaths with local sermons and gatherings. Altogether, it hints at something darker than greed, something communal. The greatest horror was not Patty herself, but the silence of those who knew. Denton was small. People noticed missing children, they saw the wagons, they heard the cries. Yet year after year the town remained hushed. Was it fear, or something older? The local church records, now almost illegible, tell of sermons in the 1820s warning of blood debts and the purification of the land. Old hymns shifted in meaning with references to lambs and sacrifice. Farmers spoke in whispers about the balance, that what Patty took somehow preserved the prosperity of others. Families prospered while others vanished. Crops thrived even in drought years. Merchants made sudden fortunes. Was Patty the town's scapegoat, or its priestess? When investigators finally dug her land, they unearthed more than human remains. They found relics, iron crosses, bone fragments arranged in patterns, vessels filled with dried blood. These were never spoken of in newspapers. They were suppressed, stored away in courthouses, burned in fireplaces, because what they suggested was too horrifying that an entire town may have benefited from her crimes. In the archives of Caroline County, Maryland, there exists a single surviving page of Patty Cannon's ledger. It lists names, ages, and strange notations. 10 years, unripe, mother, unwilling, son, taken at night. Some entries have an X beside them. Others are marked with symbols resembling inverted crosses or circles enclosing dots. Historians debate their meaning. Were they simply her own twisted codes for sale prices, or did they signify something darker? Rituals completed, offerings made. For the families who searched, those names were all that remained. No graves, no funerals, just words in Patty's cruel handwriting. Each line represented a life cut short, a bloodline severed. And yet, what's most disturbing is how many entries appear to correspond with local events. Church revivals, harvest festivals, even baptisms. As though Patty's crimes were timed, synchronized with the rituals of the very institutions meant to protect the community. The ledger wasn't just a record of crime, it was a calendar of blood. Oral histories passed down through African American families in the region tell of children who vanished in twos or threes, never alone. Witnesses described Patty's men waiting near church doors or trailing families leaving market squares. The children were gagged, thrown into wagons, and disappeared before neighbors could react. Some who survived, escaped or bought back, spoke of the night house. They described being kept in darkness, given little food, forced to chant words they didn't understand. Some claimed Patty herself would stand above them at night, humming low, broken hymns, her hands covered in soot or blood. One chilling story told of a boy who escaped and ran barefoot through the town square. He begged for help, but instead of opening their doors, families shut their shutters. By morning, he was gone again. The silence of those who saw ensured Patty's reign continued. How did she get away with it? The answer lies in the law itself. Kidnapping free African Americans was supposed to be a crime, but the Fugitive Slave Acts blurred the line between freedom and bondage. All it took was a claim, a forged paper, or a corrupt sheriff, and a free man could be declared property. Patty knew this. She exploited it with surgical cruelty, with bribes, with dinners, with whispered threats. She bound local officials to her will. Judges dismissed cases. Sheriffs looked away. Slave traders paid her handsomely, no questions asked. What the records hide. But what whispers preserve is that Patty seemed to command men in power, not just persuade them. There are stories of gatherings in her parlor where men drank from silver cups, signed papers in candlelight, and left pale, shaken, yet obedient. The law didn't just fail, it bent itself to her. Among the most unsettling truths, Patty often targeted orphans. Children without parents, without protectors, without advocates. They were taken in silence, their disappearances barely noted. Some came from local poorhouses, others from the orphan trains that moved children between states. Why orphans? Perhaps because they were easiest prey, but deeper whispers suggest another reason. In folk belief, the blood of the unclaimed holds special power. With no family to mourn them, with no lineage to bind them, their spirits wander. They are fuel. Old men in Denton recalled that Patty was especially active after epidemics, when orphan numbers swelled as though she harvested despair. These were not just kidnappings, they were selections. When Patty's home was finally searched after her arrest, among the rusted chains and blood-stained boards were carvings in the beams, spirals, inverted symbols. Some resembled ancient alchemical signs for sacrifice and transmutation. Witnesses described her muttering prayers in strange cadences, not scripture but something older. Some heard her invoke saints and demons in the same breath. And though historians dismiss this as folklore, the consistency of the accounts is disturbing. Every description aligns. Patty was not only enslaving, not only killing. She was using bodies, using blood, using silence itself as fuel, for wealth, for power, for something she believed the town needed. By the 1830s, rumors had spread beyond Denton. Outsiders began asking questions. Abolitionist newspapers hinted at a woman on the Maryland line, whose crimes reached into the dozens, maybe hundreds. But the official records are strangely clean. Court transcripts are missing. Coroner's reports vanish mid-page. Newspaper archives have gaps. It is as if someone carefully, deliberately erased her story. And yet, certain fragments survive: a letter from a preacher describing ritual desecrations, a sheriff's note about unholy gatherings, a physician's diary in which he describes treating a child who escaped her attic, his tongue burned with hot iron. The evidence was too much to fully conceal, but enough was destroyed that her crimes could be filed away as myth, and myths, unlike history, can be ignored. In 1829, Patty Cannon was finally arrested, not for murder, though dozens of bodies were later linked to her, but for kidnapping. When she entered the courthouse, crowds gathered, not in outrage, but in silence. Their eyes followed her with a strange mix of hatred and awe. The trial never truly began. Within weeks, Patty was found dead in her cell. Some say poison, some say she was silenced, some whisper she never died at all, that her body was taken away before any witness saw her corpse. No death certificate survives, no grave exists, just absence. The woman who terrorized a generation simply vanished into the cracks of history. When workers dug her property after her disappearance, they found the graves. Shallow pits, masses of bones, shackles rusted around wrists, but some remains were stranger: skeletons with jaws broken wide, spines twisted unnaturally, cuts across skulls in patterns as though inscribed. Local papers reported unfortunate victims, but among townsfolk the truth was whispered, that some of the bodies looked less human, that Patty had been trying to make something or unmake it. The earth around her farm was never fertile again. Crows gathered and never left. The ground seemed to remember. Generations of African-American families in the region still tell stories of ancestors who vanished without explanation, grandmothers who went to market and never came back, children stolen in the night, entire bloodlines cut short. The trauma is generational, woven into memory like scar tissue. One haunting story tells of a family whose name appears in Patty's ledger. Their descendants even today dream of chains rattling in the dark, of a woman's voice calling from behind walls. Trauma does not end with death. It festers, it whispers, it infects the living. Perhaps the most damning question is this: where was the church? Denton was small, but its steeple was tall, its bells loud. How did sermons ring each Sunday while screams echoed just beyond the fields? Some suggest the church was complicit, that its ministers turned scripture into justification, framing Patty's acts as part of divine will. That offerings from her household filled the church coffers. Others whispered darker tales, that the sermons themselves aligned with her rituals, the cadence of hymns masking the chants from her attic. That the two institutions, the holy and the profane, were not separate at all, but two sides of the same coin. Even after her disappearance, children in Denton played games called Patty's House. They would blindfold each other, bind hands with rope, and chant her name. Some claimed to see her face in shadows. Others swore they heard footsteps when no one was there. Generations kept the story alive, not in textbooks, but in games and nightmares. A monster in folklore, yes, but folklore born from something real, something buried in shallow earth. The question that lingers: why was she tolerated so long? The answer may lie in the hidden economy of her crimes. Every stolen body meant profit, for Patty, for traders, for sheriffs, for farmers whose fields thrived. But perhaps there was another economy, less visible: blood for prosperity, death for survival, the crops that grew too well, the merchants who thrived while others starved, the townsfolk who lived long, untroubled lives. Was it coincidence, or a contract written in silence? Patty's murders were not isolated acts. They were transactions in a ledger of corruption that spanned generations. Researchers who have stumbled across Patty's fragments describe an unsettling experience. Papers missing, archivists reluctant to assist, boxes mislabeled, entries sealed for privacy. It is as though her story is still being hidden, still being erased. One researcher wrote, "Every door closed, every page gone. It is as if someone, or something, does not want her name spoken again." The past is not dead, it is guarded. Patty Cannon was not alone. Other towns, other orphanages, other border communities tell eerily similar stories. Disappearances uncounted, graves discovered too late, institutions that looked away. It suggests a pattern, as though Patty was one node in a wider network of silence, a ritual repeating itself across geography and time. The horror is not that she existed, but that she may not have been unique. Denton today is quiet, the farm is gone, replaced by roads and fields, but locals say the air is wrong there, that machines fail, that birds gather in unnatural numbers. Descendants of her victims still dream of her. They speak of chains rattling, of a woman's voice that whispers promises in their sleep. Evil does not die when its body does. It lingers like smoke in the walls, like poison in the soil. Paddy Cannon is remembered in history books, if at all, as a kidnapper, a criminal who preyed upon free African Americans. But that version is sanitized. It strips away the silence of the town, the complicity of the church, the ledger of names aligned with ritual. The truth is darker. She was not alone, and she was not stopped. She was allowed. The bones unearthed in 1829 were not only the remains of her victims. They were evidence of something the nation still cannot face, that its prosperity was watered with blood, that its foundations were laid atop unmarked graves, and that silence itself was a willing accomplice. And that silence has never ended.